Mabrika, everybody, and welcome back to Taino Areyto Day 2020. We are joined today by Reach Academy and Uncle Gerald, who is a genealogist. So this is session 2 in the child-led interviews that we have. So over to you, Leah Simone and Matthew.
Mabrika, Kasik, and Vika, and Uncle Gerald.
Seek BK and Uncle Gerald.
Ahom.
Good afternoon, Uncle Gerald. On the behalf of Grade 5 at Reach Academy, I would like to thank you coming and inviting me to interview you and to come and chat with me.
My name is Leah Simone. On behalf of Reach Academy, I would like to ask you a few questions, but first let me introduce my school. Reach Academy is 8 years old. It is located at 2 Whitcomb Road in St. Andrew. Reach Academy is a wonderful place. We have outstanding teachers, an interesting curriculum, and the best of friends. Now, let's get on with the questions. First, how do you prove if a person was from Taino descendant?
So the question, how will you prove if a person is of Taino descent? So that one is it has a lot of answers. I hope you guys like answers, right? So answer number 1 is family, right? Some people have oral history from family that says that they're of Taino descent. So you have cases where people pass down information, family member by family member, grandmother to father to mother to, grandchildren. Now, the second way is genealogy, right? Genealogy means precisely the same thing I said, but backwards, right? So if you, for example, Leah or Matthew, you you ask your parents who were their parents and maybe their parents' parents. You start writing this information down and you look in certain archives, you're able to go back and possibly trace back a lineage that is Taino. Now, third way is, and it's a new way, this is like the new kid on the block, is DNA, right? DNA also has the capability of being able to trace back lines that are Native American and precisely Taino, especially now in 2020. Now, the tricky part about that is that absence, the DNA is it's conditional, which means that if it proves it, it means a yes. If it doesn't prove it, it's not a no. Because you don't inherit all of your DNA from all of your family.
100%.
Do you guys know what DNA is?
Yes.
I know what it is. I don't quite know what it stands for. It's like the patterns that make up you.
Wonderful,
Or
wonderful, wonderful.
your genes.
And that also means so your brother or sister could have a different DNA from you. Is that correct? Uncle Gerald?
Yep. That is definitely correct. This is why they're not always of the same height.
That's right.
Might be allergic to different foods. You could have one sibling that can't eat peanuts, the other one can't eat shrimp. So that's all the DNA. That's what the DNA is doing. You're only 50% the same as your other sibling. So you're 50% different, unless you're identical twins. Then you're 100%.
And then it doesn't necessarily have to be 100%.
No, it's like
Because,
90, yeah.
Yeah, because
The crossover.
as it crosses over, they've had. Sorry, I'm just butting in here, but research have shown that there's a mother did her twins are identical twins, and they had slightly different, more or less the same, but slightly different DNAs.
Mabrika, Miss Williams, how are you?
Mabrika.
Hello, good afternoon.
I was researching what a genealogist does, and I got that it gets your family members. If you want to know who your family members are or your ancestors, a genealogist would connect those pieces of your DNA. As you said earlier today, your DNA. So grade 5 had some insightful questions for you I would like to ask. This is a first question. Why is it important to have a genealogist in Jamaica or this region?
Okay. Why is it? Well, the importance is very it has a lot of good reasons, right? So first of all, the more you know about your family, the more you know about yourself, right? And traditionally, genealogy has been more so available for people of descent from queens and kings, especially in Europe, right? Where there is, like, for example, if somebody is, let's say somebody like Queen Elizabeth, right? Or somebody like that, they already have like their genealogy all the way back to the 1300s. But for us in the Caribbean, that's not the case, right? We have a more fragmented genealogy, so we have to work harder at putting the pieces together because we know we have a lot of different events that made us have different outcomes and ancestors. For example, there's slavery, there's indentured servitude, there is also the record keeping not being the same, right, in the Caribbean. So it's really important because it's a region of the world that actually doesn't have the best genealogy right now. So a lot of work has to be done.
Okay. And the second part to that question was, how did you end up working as a genealogist in Jamaica?
Can I add something as well? Just from what the young man has asked, is that also in Jamaica, we have an upsurge of finding out about our Taino heritage. And that's been introduced into the schools recently in 2016. So to have a genealogy would actually prove that the Tainos were here and their DNA is still in the generation coming down. So that's a big proof, and it's also a very advantageous position to have as a genealogist, to be able to prove that. Yes.
Okay.
Oh, definitely. That's actually let me just add one thing there. That's definitely something that has, as I said earlier, because when people are in Europe, for example, the genealogy is a bit better, especially for the higher class kings and queens, right? More so than poor Europeans. And then for us in the Caribbean, we have a lot of broken genealogy, right? And the Tainos being one of the lineages that we have that are not necessarily well represented, right? So because of that, this is very important in sort of balancing and giving us like a full scope of what we actually have in our families.
Right.
Okay. Well, I have a question that relates to the Tainos. How, Uncle Gerald, how can you tell the difference between a Taino and an Amerindian? How do genealogists do that?
Okay, so the difference between a Taino and an Amerindian. Amerindian is a generic name for all Native Americans, right? Taino is one type of Native American, right? So it would be the same as saying, you know, like, how can you tell the difference between like a sour mango and different types, you know, and what a mango is. So the thing with that is, with the genealogy on paper, sometimes you can tell by looking at the papers if the person is Amerindian. Sometimes you can figure out where they're coming from by paper, while other times with DNA, you're able to pinpoint it because you're able to do comparisons to different Native Americans, different Amerindians, and see how much they're alike to one versus another. Because the DNA can show you closeness and distance. So for example, if I took a person from Jamaica right now and I tested them, and then I compared their Taino DNA or their Native American DNA, their Amerindian DNA, and I compared it to Tainos who have been tested in the past versus, let's say, Mayans in Central America. If they more closely match the Mayans, that's a hint that that person might actually have Mayan ancestry. But if they more closely match the Tainos, then that might tell you that that person has Taino ancestry.
Okay.
I also have another question. How are you you able to identify the physical features of a Taino?
That's a very good one. See, that one is something that people are still figuring out as well, right? The first thing we have, the only thing we had for a long time was the accounts of Europeans. And anytime, if you've ever played game of like secret and gossip, like in school, you might say something and then it changes by the time it gets to the last person. And that's very similar to how European conquest happened. The Europeans described certain things that were similar to them. So the first reference we have is the European diaries. However, the DNA is putting a better face on this, like a more scientific face. And in the DNA, you can tell, as far as like their features, there's limit. There's a limit as to how much you can reconstruct on a person, but there is definitely inside the DNA. Think about the DNA as a sort of like a book, right? Like a very long book with thousands of pages, and there are lines in that book that have information that can tell you what type of hair the person possibly had, right? What what type of eyes, sometimes the skin color, sometimes things like the resistance they had to certain
Structures.
diseases. Mhm.
And structures in the face as well, apparently.
Yeah, some of the facial. Now, there's one little caveat there. While we were able to tell with the DNA what the Tainos possibly looked like, it's still a work in progress because most of the earliest DNA tests that were done in studies are based on Europeans. So most of the feature sets are European based. So it's easier to tell if somebody had blue versus brown eyes than it is to tell if somebody had thick versus thin hair, right? So things that have to do with natives are less. It's only now in 2020, I mean, like in the last 10 years, that we're able to find out more features. But it's definitely something you can see in the DNA, for sure.
If
All right.
technically the Tainos didn't die out, why do they say that in the textbooks?
So why do they?
Good question.
That's a very good question. So the way that people tend to think of peoples, right? They tend to think of them as being lineal beings, right? We're not. Nobody is 100% of anything, right? So the way people think of Tainos, they think of them as being folks that if you're not 100% Taino today, that means that the Tainos died out. There are Tainos now, Taino descendants, right? The same way that there are descendants of people in all sorts of places and countries. People in the UK, for example, are descendants of Anglo-Saxons and Germans and French and Romans, and they're a mix of people, right? So you're not really going to find. There were Romans in the UK, but you're not going to find them today. A full Roman person, you're going to find people of Roman descent. So it's the same thing with the Tainos. They there's two things. They're that, and also the exaggeration by the people who were writing these letters, because the information we have on the disappearance of the Taino is all from letters people would write back to Europe. And in a lot of these letters, people exaggerated very often. Like, yeah, there's no more Tainos left. There's only 15 left. But it was a very bad census, very bad studies that they did on the population. And they had a lot. It's the same way. I mean, right now, if you go to the doctor and you want to get attention, you say you're very sick, even if you're not. And
Gerald, Gerald, was it also that it was a lot to do with the slaves, the enslaved people? Why they said that the Tainos were all.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly what I'm getting at. That the Europeans exaggerated about the disappearance of the Taino in order to get more slave labor from West Africa. Because if you say that there's no more Indians left, no more Native Americans left, then that justifies a budget from Europe, right? From England at the time, from France and from Spain and Portugal, to get more funds in order to buy more people from West Africa and send them to the Caribbean. If they would have said the truth about it, then they're like, well, I'm not going to send you money for 10,000 people. I'm going to send you money for 5,000 people. And that's not what they wanted. They wanted to exaggerate.
Also, as well, it kind of quells or reduces the amount of people trying to take back the land as well. Because if you don't believe that the land belongs to you, then you're not necessarily going to fight for it. you know? So if you believe there are no Tainos left, then no matter like if that becomes the rhetoric in the culture, then you're not going to necessarily be fighting back for that land, you know?
So, Uncle Gerald, how is the environment like when if you're going somewhere to test somebody, or how is it like as a genealogist? Like, what's the feeling when you're doing your job? Like when you're like going through to see the ancestors of the family back. What's the feeling of like that? What's the feeling of that?
I think it's definitely different for each person. It's kind of like when you eat food. Some people might have some food and they're like gone and they love it, and some people are a little more less emotional. With me, I'm very connected with it because what I do is when I see somebody's family member and I see details about that family member, I start to envision that person. So you start to form almost personal relationships with each individual that you find on your way. And you get excited. You get and sometimes you get frustrated because you can't go back any further. So when that happens and you can't go back any further, and then you like all of a sudden just break that brick wall and you're on the other side, then you get very excited and you start connecting things, and it's something that actually you go to sleep and you still remember and you still think about. It's not the type of job that you just do it and then you go home and you're done. It's something that stays with you for the rest of the day and the rest of your life.
Generally, how long does the process of researching take, and what are the methods that you use to check your research, and how long would that take?
Did you also want to find out what the procedure was to get your DNA tested?
So the length of research, right? We're very connected to his question as well, to Matthew's question. The length of the research has a lot to do with let me separate two things. There's DNA and then there's research via the genealogy. The DNA takes about a month to process, right? From the moment that you spit into a tube to the moment that the labs give you back results. And then the research part, right, which is both on the DNA and on the genealogy, that actually doesn't end, right? It begins, but it doesn't end, in the sense that it depends on what your goal is. So if you just want to know who your great grandmother is, your grandmother's mother, then it might not take too long. You know, most people know who their grandparents are, and then finding out who her mother or father was won't be too hard. That might take a couple of hours at most. Now, if you're trying to go back further and further, that can definitely take up days. There's things that I've discovered years later. So it's a never ending, it's a data mine, basically. It's a never ending process.
I have a question on the Tainos.
Mm-hmm.
How did you find out where Tainos were living and continue your research now that they aren't living anymore?
So how did I find out? Well, one thing I'll say, they're technically living inside of us in the Caribbean, right? The same way that that people, for example, in Norway still have Vikings in them as far as their descent. Finding out where Tainos were living has a lot to do with there's a combination of DNA that has proven that they were a uniform people. There's a recent study that just came out and they were able to confirm that. But from the historical accounts, that was the gist, that the whole Caribbean was inhabited by one people. So every single Caribbean island in the Caribbean basin was inhabited by an extension of the same group. Almost like different islands were different clubs and different families.
And we can also see from archaeological digs where the Taino remains, like finding ceramics and like old like foundational areas for the Yukayekes, the villages. And we actually found one recently in Jamaica at Whitemore, a burial site in Spanish Town. So we find them all the time, and they're always being uncovered, like all over the Greater Antilles.
Because I remember on a field trip, you said that my teacher was asking you when I was in grade 4, So are you a Taino, she asked, and then you said you have the blood of a Taino?
Yeah, just to expand on that, is that, as you say, you look at me and you look at Jenna, and we're two different type of coloring, aren't we?
Mm-hmm.
But we're mother and daughter, so it's the same sort of thing. So if you might expect Tainos to look a certain way, but as it comes down descendants, you might, the facial change might there, but inside of your blood, the blood, you have the markings of the different races that you might have
Had in your family.
had in your family.
Right.
Do you understand that? So they might say, right, I have Taino blood, I have African blood, I have maybe a touch of European, and the DNA tells you all of this. So when I had my DNA tested, that's what it told me. It's there. So you probably won't look like that, but it could be. And somebody could say you look like a Taino from that period, and you might not be from that. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, but you still have the blood.
Right, 100%.
That's right.
I can say another. I'll say another thing is that it has to do with your phenotype, right? Is what you look like, right? Your face, your hair, your skin tone, your height. That's all your phenotype, and the phenotype is a very small percent of the DNA. It's only 5% of the DNA. So 100% of Matthew and 100% of Leah. Out of that 100%, only 5 is what you look like.
Go. There you go.
Okay. Can I go with my question now?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Who is the person with the closest Taino relative?
Who is the person with the closest Taino relative that I've seen?
Yes.
So I have a friend that I did the genealogy for, who's from Puerto Rico, and his great grandmother was half Taina. So that's pretty close. That's not too long ago. That's less than 150 years ago.
Thank you.
3 generations, about 3 generations, I'd say.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Have you found out how the Tainos were able to build such sturdy boats?
How the Tainos were able to, the first thing is they got to the islands on boats. So they have been practicing for a long time, and practice makes perfect. So they have been practicing with some of the materials they had in South America, and that helped them make good boats. And then when they got to the islands, they made even better boats because they were able to reinforce and make them sturdier and be able to do longer voyages back and forth and bring heavier things like heavier animals, dogs, monkeys, and all sorts of animals they brought from South America.
Okay.
Can I ask a question?
Mm-hmm.
Right. No. What do you imagine a Taino to be?
Well, I imagine them to be creative because they didn't really grow up with a lot of electronics like we did in this century now. So they would be creative and they would know more about nature and how to use it if we were to ever encounter a time. That's what I would.
You think they're all dead? Yes.
Well, like Uncle Gerald said, and you said there's blood in them. So I don't know, but I think so. Well, I think so.
You still think they're all dead?
Yes.
Uncle Gerald, can you clarify and just
Sorry, I thought you were
give a
talking
rebuttal?
to me. So yeah, so as you were saying, we had mentioned earlier about the blood in people, right? And how we are descendants of them. So you can't kill somebody, right, or a culture if people still have, one thing is their blood and the second thing is their culture, because culture is what keeps alive a people. right? People are not just, you're not just descendant from them genetically, but you also carry their culture, their material culture. For example, when you have certain fruits in Jamaica and certain foods in Jamaica, even like jerk seasoning has a lot to do with the Tainos, for example, right? And
and
soursop
also
is
the style of cooking of jerk is very Taino. Abacut is
Pepper pot
actually
and a lot of like cassava.
cassava, right? We still eat a lot of cassava. We still eat bami, which is one of the islands that keep that culture alive.
yeah. So you have you have something where you have both descent in your blood and you also have material culture. So you have things you still practice and your family still practices. So we never really lost that connection with the originals, the Tainos. And it's never going to go away because we're still going to keep eating soursop. We're still going to have a lot of these things in our families. And for most people, it's also going to still be in their blood because we pass it down as we marry each other.
Yeah, as a tradition, we'll
Mhm.
still have that to eat.
Correct.
Like bami, I like bami for breakfast. So yeah, and they used to have that.
I think that's a very good distinction to make for children, and even as a teacher. I think we tend to take it for granted that if we don't see anyone that looks like what we think the Tainos would have looked like, then it means that they don't exist anymore.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And as much as we do teach the connections, so they're able to say, okay, they know the Bami and they know the names of places and
That's
so on.
right.
They're still not thinking of it as a continuation of the people in the same sense. So I think it's good to differentiate that.
I would also say one thing that precisely with what I was saying earlier, that you're only 5%. Your features are only 5% of your DNA. So it doesn't take a lot of DNA to erase stereotypical Taino look, and it also doesn't take a lot of DNA for it to show up as well. And sometimes it might not show up in one family member, but it might show up in another. And that's something that's very tricky about features. You really can't look at somebody and guess. Like if I did a game with you guys one day and I said, guess who is the most Taino? Most people would probably get it wrong by looking at people. Same thing with guess who's the most African or the most European. It's very hard to tell.
What about Chinese?
Yep. Very hard to tell.
Have you when you have tested somebody or when you have done a research on somebody's family, have you ever gotten it wrong? Like told somebody that it was when you researched it and you did your work to find it, but you are incorrect, and but you still tell the person that answer, but you didn't know you were incorrect. What happens then? What happens if you're incorrect?
So the way it works is that there is no right and wrong answer. There's no concrete answers with genealogy and genetics. There is, it works like science, right? So in science, you have theories, and some theories are correct today and they can be incorrect tomorrow. And that's okay. It's okay to admit it. It's okay to be wrong. It's nothing bad. So when that does happen, it has happened to me. It has happened to me with my own family tree. So when that does happen, you simply correct it and you try to verify it as much as possible with other information. You know, you might be like, okay, let me make sure that this person that I have wrong is actually 100% wrong.
I also have a question. It's related to that.
Mm-hmm.
If someone thought before that they were a specific ethnicity and they did all the cultural things, and then they get the DNA test and they said they're mostly another ethnicity instead of the other. How bad of an experience would that be?
It's happened a lot.
So, so that depends a lot on the person, right? Some people are still very firm about who they are, right? Some people are not affected by results like that. Some people are. Some people it might make them, cry. It might make them emotional, and that's also okay because it's something that you experience when you learn something new, right? It's something you get flooded with all this information. You're like, wait a minute, I thought I was this, but I'm also this, or I didn't know that I had this, you know? And some of it is because sometimes not everybody tells the truth. In some families, some people also, you might think something and somebody either didn't have the information, or sometimes people misled, you know, sometimes people lie and you find out later, you know.
Also, you can be, like, for example, you could be born in Jamaica and all of your DNA could be Chinese and Indian. Because you're exposed to that Jamaican culture, you become Jamaican. You have a Jamaican sensibility, a Jamaican idea, and your culture is Jamaican. So the amount of blood you have doesn't necessarily tell you what culture that you're going to live by. So that's a choice that you make consciously. It's nothing to do with science. That's to do with your heart and how you feel, how your life should be lived.
I 100% agree with that as well.
I actually know of a young man from England, you saying that, and he had been brought up as African English, yes, and he was ill, and then he found out his mother was actually Welsh, not Jamaican, and he was like, my God, all my life I have been living a lie. He felt he was living a lie, and all the racism that he was getting, he said, was uncalled for. He put up with it. Then he found out that he shouldn't be getting that racism. So I understand what you're saying. How do you make up for all of that when you've thought you were one thing, then you get a DNA test and you're something else? So some people it can be a little devastating.
Yeah, I think things like that. I would add another thing. I think things like that are really, if you want to be strong about getting results, you have to know, as Kasik said, that who you are as a person is your culture, right? So that is your foundation. And then as far as what you're gonna have in your DNA, that's gonna be endless, right? You're always gonna be finding out more and more things. Because, for example, say you find out something about an African side, then you have to dig into what that means as far as the different peoples and ethnic groups, and that can you can be led to believe one thing and it might be something else, and that's always going to be, it's like an onion, it's a lot of different layers.
And I think that's why DNA and genealogy pair so well together, because you have the science and then you find out what that means. What does that mean to you as a person, you know?
Bonus question. What do you like most about your job?
What do I like the most about my job? Helping people. Simple answer. I love helping people because a lot of times people don't know how to do these things or don't have the time for them. So it fills me with joy to be able to help people do something, especially because I've become good at it, right? So because I'm good at it, it doesn't take a lot of effort on my side, and it gives a lot of happiness to the person on the other side.
Okay.
Have you got Taino ancestry, Leanne?
I don't know. I've never did know.
Well, now we really don't know, and we want to find out.
We're doing DNA testings in the foreseeable future. So we will call on you and give you that opportunity too.
Yeah, we're going to have a center at the Taino Heritage Camp that's going to be opening up soon, where people can come and get counseling and learn about their DNA and have a test if they want to have a test done as well.
For coming to this interview and answering our questions to help us understand more about genealogy and the Tainos.
For chatting with grade 5 and Reach Academy. Hopefully we can meet up someday again, and I learned about genealogy. Thank you for today. Keep safe and have a good day.
Hahom, Uncle Gerald, and Hahom Reach Academy. Thank you so much for coming today. We really learned a lot, and I hope that everybody watching, children and adults, are able to get an insight into what DNA is and what genealogy is. And if anybody has any questions at all, you can reach out to us on all of our platforms, Instagram, Facebook, email, Taino Heritage Camp. So I'd just like to say thank you on behalf of myself, the cacique of Coki Yukayeke, and the BK. Hahom, everybody, for coming today.
Ahom.